I saw this on Reddit earlier and I thought it was really interesting. It's that the Rangers signed deGrom for 185 million, and then the Mets spent 187.7 on Justin Verlander, Senga, and Quintana. I wanted to talk a little bit about Jacob deGrom and just kind of how like that all, because it was weird. I was reading about like when deGrom went to Texas, I read that he didn't give the Mets a chance to counter their offer. Was that just because he knew that the Mets weren't coming close to that, or was that part of like a gradual distancing of himself to the organization, do you think?
That's a great question. So I remember back, not the winter meetings, but the GM meetings. This was first week in November. Billy Epler, Mets GM, has his press conference. And I just asked him point blank, like, do you get the impression that this guy wants to be here, that this guy wants to continue to be a New York Met? He said, yeah, and that they were in basically lockstep throughout the whole process of like, we're gonna keep ourselves in communication. We're gonna share information or like whatever the other side hears, we'll be in touch, that kind of thing. And I think that they were up until a certain point, and up until that certain point was probably maybe a few days before it became official that he was going to the Rangers, I would assume, because clearly like that deal doesn't get done in a matter of a couple of hours. Like there's a lead up to it, right? So like I would assume that it was at least a couple of days where things were getting a little bit serious. From what I gathered, I think he officially signed on a Friday, and I think it was that Thursday where things got really, really serious within like the Texas organization, where other people were hearing about the deal possibly transpiring. So I don't know if I'm necessarily surprised that he didn't. I mean, this was a guy who, I mean, he came out to, simple man as his walkout for taking the mound. I mean, he was, not to say that he was not comfortable in New York. I don't think that's the case. He clearly excelled, and I don't want to make too much of that because he was able to do his job and he was able to be the best pitcher in baseball. But I mean, I just think that it got to a point where he got a ton of money for somebody that hasn't pitched that much in the last 2 years, right? And I guess he had to know, or his agency had to know, that maybe the Mets were not going to approach that number. Because if you're looking to get into a bidding war, you extend it, right? Like you tell the other side, hey, this is what we got, and can you match it? So the fact that he didn't, I think that tells you, one, that maybe he just didn't want to stay in New York to begin with, and then secondly, maybe he also thought that that was going to be the best he got. And frankly, when I was polling agents and scouts and just executives in the game about what this contract could look like, people said like, maybe in a perfect world, if you're a club, you give him 2 years. That was never going to happen, right? Um, then you go 3 or 4. But the team that was probably going to sign him was going to be the team that ended up giving him 5, right? And there was probably only going to be one team that did that, whoever it was, ended up being the Rangers. So in that sense, not surprised at all.
Brian, I want you to put yourself in the mind of Jacob deGrom here, because we talked about this on the podcast. I think it was around the All-Star break. He was just asked, and he's like, point blank, Jacob deGrom, are you going to exercise your opt out? And he says, yes, absolutely. Very vocal about wanting to opt out. Like, what factors do you think kind of led to, this distancing and eventual his decision to play elsewhere, you think, Brian?
Well, first, I think he was going to opt out no matter what because he would have got more money, even if it was going back to New York. But I think Will was right in the sense of playing in New York is not for everybody. It doesn't mean he didn't enjoy his time there, but you're living in the city. There's a lot of traffic. There's all those things that go along with it. And I'm not saying that I personally wouldn't play in New York if given the opportunity, or like that people don't like it while they're there. But, he's from the South. He's from Florida, or at least he went to college in Florida. I think he's from Florida. But Texas is an appealing place. I mean, it's not, that stadium's awesome, first of all. Second of all, it's not like right downtown in the city. There's other areas around where you can live. There's no state income tax to go with all that money that they just offered at them. But obviously, they want to win. They're making moves. We said this too. Bruce Bochy didn't come out of retirement to play, manage a shitty team or anything like that. So I just think it's a different appeal. And while I'm sure he enjoys his time with New York, sometimes, there's other factors and you just kind of want to move on or play somewhere else too. But I do, it is leaving that team, that talent. It was definitely, it's definitely interesting too.
Well, how should Mets fans remember Jacob deGrom as he goes on to a new organization?
Well, in Mets lore, it's Tom Seaver and then everybody else. You know, it's like, and like, is he number two? I don't know. Maybe Dwight Gooden's number two, but if he's not number two, he's number three. And in my opinion, he probably is number two. The difference, a big difference too, though, is that Tom Seaver and Doc Gooden, they were on teams that won World Series. deGrom was not, right? And that's really nothing to do with him, but that's just how you kind of get remembered, I guess. It's part of your story. He was a guy that unfortunately would give up one run and would lose 1-0 after pitching 7 innings. Like that was his life as a New York Met for way too long. And that's pretty sad. It's a shame that also that he was not able to, be a huge part of last year's success and last year's run. I mean, he only pitched a handful of games in the regular season, had the one playoff start. It's a shame, it really is. But I mean, the guy won a couple Cy Youngs. I mean, when he left because of the injuries, he was the best pitcher in baseball. And then right when he came back, he was the best pitcher in baseball again, pretty much. So sure, he faded down the stretch a little bit there, but probably would have ride the ship. I mean, he's never been bad. That's also the thing. I mean, this was a guy who played shortstop for a while in college. People didn't have the highest of expectations for him originally, but then once he got to the major leagues, he was never bad. Like there was never a stretch where you said like, deGrom's losing it or deGrom's had a poor stretch. It never happened. He was always good, and most of the time he was elite. And so, yeah, I think you remember him as right behind Tom Seaver, and then the conversation for number two. And like I said before, if he's not number two, he's right there with Dwight Gooden, tied for second, or if not third.
It's funny you mentioned the run support thing because that was always like if you look at Jacob deGrom's stats, his win-loss record doesn't jump off the page to you. And I just remember from an outsider's perspective, always just feeling bad for him because you're right. It would be a lot of like he would give up one run over 7 or 8 innings and he'd lose 1-0, or he'd give up 2 runs and he'd lose like 2-1. Like I feel like that may have contributed, right? Because like that's got to be the most frustrating thing for a pitcher to go out there and pitch your heart out every night and then just have a team that, for a little bit there, they weren't backing him up on his starts. So that I'm sure he didn't love that.
No, it's like you were waiting for him to like throw a no hitter and lose somehow one of those days, right? Like it was like, man, this is just not really great to watch. I mean, he had one of those Cy Youngs that like that was when people really started to be like, yeah, the win stat does not matter like whatsoever. Like we got to give this dude the Cy Young. He's the best pitcher in baseball. So maybe that's part of his maybe that's part of his like lore and his history. It was just like changing that whole conversation, threw that completely out the window in like modern baseball. So that's a good thing at least.